welcome to Risky Business. So now that I finished the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters for the 8-bit trilogy, I'm really excited to share my thoughts. Are these the best versions of that 8-bit trilogy? Stay to the end, and you'll find out. So these games have already been remade a number of times since the NES and Famicom releases. The most notable one is probably the WonderSwan Color remakes because those got ported to the GBA and the PlayStation. There are also mobile remakes, there were some really cool revamped ones for the PSP, and then there was that really weird 3D remake of Final Fantasy III, but that's an entirely different story. So what do these remakes bring to the table that their predecessors didn't? Well, aside from being in full HD and widescreen for the first time ever, all the extra content that was added in the previous versions has been removed, so the experience is a lot more true to the original titles. The characters and environments also look much closer to the original versions. There are some differences, but we'll get into that later. I've been playing Final Fantasy since the first one was released in the US on the Nintendo, and I even played translated Famicom versions of 2 and 3 long before there was ever an official US release. I'm always happy to revisit these classics, and even the original NES Final Fantasy, with all its flaws, has a special place in my heart. The graphics have been completely redone for these games, with higher resolution versions of the pixel characters and monsters that we know and love. The pixels have a lot of added detail and additional color, while still being true and loyal to the original design. The remarkable exception is Final Fantasy II, whose sprites look a lot more like Amano's art and the sprites that would appear in later iterations of the title. This is a puzzling decision given how faithful 1 and 3 are to their roots. Vivid backgrounds have been added to battle scenes, whose original versions featured sparse, drab environments against a black backdrop. The only kind of offset to that is, unfortunately, in the first game, the way the characters sit on the screen looks a little bit awkward sometimes, like they're floating in the air. Effects and animation in battles are just buzzing with action, and the battlefield and menus are far removed from the black boxes of the Famicom and the NES. The battleground is filled with light, shadow, and high contrast flair. The cities, castles, wilderness, and dungeons look familiar and evoke deep feelings of nostalgia, but still impress with their sharpness and vibrancy. Many dungeon areas are now populated with floating debris, and water and ocean sparkle with vigor, adding new dimensions of life to the vintage look of the game worlds. I am very impressed with the upgraded visuals, and these are certainly my favorite version of the trilogy to look at. The only thing I really dislike about these visuals is that there are now unified spell effects. Spells of the same name look identical across all 3 games. For example, Fire looks the same on all 3 games, Blizzard looks the same on all 3 games, Curaga looks the same on all 3 games. I feel like this causes the spell to lose some of their character. It's an obvious improvement in 1, whose spell effects were really lame on the NES, but it takes some of the charm away from 2 and 3. The Pixel remasters don't just look great, but they also sound phenomenal. The score was redone with Uematsu himself directing, and all the tracks have been brilliantly expanded with the spirited sounds of strings, brass, and woodwinds, giving the dated tracks a symphonic revamp that really pops. Far from the chiptunes of old, the digital quality audio arouses the spirit of adventure. You will find yourself stunned by the vastly improved versions of classic, recognizable themes. And what's old is new again. While the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters shine in all areas, the quality of life improvements to the gameplay are particularly refreshing. An auto battle feature has been added, which repeats the last action of each character and speeds up the game, making all those pesky random battles significantly less tedious. A world map is now available at all times, and that can be expanded and shrunk. That map is also present in dungeons, and in Final Fantasy III it even displays where the treasures are located. You can also open up a large and more detailed world map, which shows all previously visited areas as yellow dots, and new points of interest as gray dots. Shops and inventory screens provide detail for any item or piece of equipment, and you can toggle back and forth between the stats and the special effects of items, so information you may not have known about those items is now readily available for you. The new inventory system is the same across all 3 games, and you have basically an almost unlimited capacity to carry items. Previously in these games you had a pretty hard cap of how much stuff you could carry, The NES version of Final Fantasy I was notorious for this because you could only carry a total of 32 pieces of equipment for the entire party, 16 weapons and 16 pieces of armor. And that would force the player to throw away items that might have otherwise been useful to make room. Final Fantasy II had a very small inventory that filled up very quickly. The downside to all these convenience improvements is that the leveling is now extremely fast, and enemies drop way more money than they ever did before. Shops are a lot cheaper as well. Even Final Fantasy II with the use it or lose it stat leveling system is way more generous with points. You can no longer lose points to a stat, and it's possible to become really powerful very early in the game with virtually no effort. There will still be times when the game becomes very challenging, but this is mitigated by a quick save feature, which allows you to save anywhere, and an autosave feature, which will return you to the most recent autosave in the event that you should die. This allows you to try the difficult battles again without having to travel all the way from your last save point, which in these older games was a real headache. There's some other improvements too, like you no longer have to spend points to change jobs in 3, and all 3 games allow saving in the overworld without having to rest. You'll recall that at least in Final Fantasy I, you had to use a tent or go to an inn to save, and that is no longer the case. Of course, these 3 games, being from the 8-bit era, do not have any save points inside the dungeons. So all these changes all together, they make the game an overall much more relaxed experience, and it virtually eliminates any and all tedious grinding. On the other hand, there are a lot of elements that were left to their roots, like the points per level magic system in 1 and 3, which makes it kind of annoying to try to manage your spells, and the weapon and magic levels in 2, which are a little bit of a pain in the ass as well. Unlike Final Fantasy 1 and 2, 3 has some significant but baffling changes. Each job has a different list of battle commands from their Famicom counterpart. For example, Dark Knights and Rangers cannot use white magic, and the Bard no longer has his scare and cheer commands, but can attack with his harp. It's strange, since the Pixel Remaster has otherwise kept faithful to the source. Final Fantasy III also seems a lot harder than the others, with individual encounters being more difficult and leveling being a little bit slower. So I'm not sure why 3 was changed, but 1 and 2 were not changed hardly at all. There are a couple of minor issues with these versions, at least on Steam. For one, the fonts by default are virtually unreadable, but it's really super easy to fix. There's also a lot of screen tearing, but I fixed that with my video drivers. I don't think these are issues on the mobile versions, since the text seems to be formatted with mobile in mind. Overall though, I think these remasters are fantastic. I strongly recommend picking them up. Every aspect of the games has been improved, and it's an excellent way to experience 30-year-old games updated to make them more accessible today. I'll also be reviewing Final Fantasy IV Pixel Remaster on this channel very soon, so please subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss that or any of my other gaming content, which includes reviews, tutorials, and video essays. Please follow me on social media using the links in the description if you want to see some of my insightful tweets and Facebook statuses. And if you would like to see more of this kind of content on my channel, please consider joining my Patreon to help support us directly. And you can also follow me on Twitch. I stream semi-annually. Thank you for watching, and until next time, game over.